Hello, everybody, and welcome to this seminar. This is the first of the new year. I'm Eric Harrison. I'm Deputy Director at Headquarters, and I'm standing in as your chair this evening. We've got a couple of great presenters with a very interesting talk, and I'm sure that you didn't log on to listen to me, so I'm going to immediately give the floor to Peter Cornick and Shanna Christie from NatCen to talk about the activities that they've been doing within the Centre for Social Survey Transformation. You have the floor.
So the aim of today's webinar is to introduce NatCen's approach to remodeling or transforming social surveys. I'm going to talk about why survey transformation is important, why NatCen has set up a Centre for Social Survey Transformation, and our approach to survey transformation, known as the remodel approach. I'm also going to show how we're implementing this approach on the British Social Attitudes Survey. My colleague Shanna will then talk about our continuing plans with BSA and some of the challenges we've identified in transitioning an individual level face-to-face survey to a web-first design. Firstly, I just want to talk briefly about why remodeling or transforming surveys is important. In the UK, the majority of high-quality social surveys are administered face-to-face, but face-to-face surveys face a number of challenges which were apparent even before the pandemic. These include things like falling response rates, changing societal expectations on how, why, when, and where we're able to complete surveys, and rising costs as a result of those previous two. And the pandemic has only sort of exacerbated this and shown how risky reliance on a single mode of data collection can be. Many national statistics surveys are conducted solely face-to-face, and we're not prepared for a sort of wicked event like the pandemic. And that meant that many were forced to transition very quickly to alternative designs, often which were less than optimal and not fully understood. And the quick switch meant that there were often gaps in the collection of data. So survey commissioners and methodologists are increasingly looking for more agile and affordable data collection methods. But changing survey mode is also risky. Any change in mode brings about complex trade-offs regarding representation, measurement, respondent experience, time and cost, which are rarely fully understood. So NatCen has launched the new Centre for Social Survey Transformation to help understand these trade-offs. The Centre is a team of survey research specialists delivering methodological, analytical and developmental research projects. We've got an initial focus on working with survey commissioners to transition surveys from face-to-face to web-first or mixed mode designs. And our work is informed by the following principles. We're methodologically neutral, we're guided by empirical evidence, we provide clear, impartial summaries and recommendations, and we put the survey respondent at the heart of everything we do. Thinking about the trade-offs that we find when we transition surveys, the direction and extent of those trade-offs will differ for each survey. And it's important to consider the impact of any change in mode thoroughly before making an informed decision about the long-term design of a survey. To help inform decision-making on transforming surveys, we've developed the remodel approach. And this provides a clear and systematic process for transforming social surveys and generating robust evidence around the trade-offs involved. By using well-established techniques based on a deep understanding of the research literature and placing emphasis on empirical evidence, the remodel approach is methodologically neutral, and it aims only to identify the optimal solution to any research needs. So the NatCen remodel approach breaks down the survey transformation process into 6 discrete stages or work packages: review, evaluate, model, design, experiment, and launch. Each of these stages seeks to address specific issues relevant to the transformation process, from defining the design parameters to assessing and quantifying the trade-offs involved in alternatives designs, and ultimately launching a new survey. To achieve this, each stage has its own defined aims and outputs, and I'll just take you through those quickly now. So the first stage is the review stage, and the aim of this is to review what information the survey commissioner, data users, and wider stakeholders require from a survey. This is used to summarize the information needs, so the research questions, and any associated requirements of the design, which are called the design parameters. These design parameters could include all sorts of things, such as the definition of the target population, any analytical requirements, the importance of maintaining any existing time series, required timeframes for delivery, and the budget envelope, amongst many others. And the output at this stage is just a clear set of research questions and design parameters. We then move on to the evaluate stage. So having established the design parameters required to meet the research questions, the next stage is to evaluate the feasibility of alternative survey designs. Here we first conduct an expert review to determine survey designs with the potential to meet those design parameters. We would then typically shortlist around 5 potential designs for further review, and we then consider the strengths and limitations and risks of each design to summarize the trade-offs each might bring. To do this in a systematic way, we consider a range of quality dimensions concerned with the quality and usability of the data. On this slide, just sort of outline a table of these dimensions, and these quality dimensions are based on a modified version of the total survey quality framework. To aid the usability of this stage and to make it easier to assess where the trade-offs within each design lie and what their impact will be, we group the dimensions into those which are solely concerned with data quality, so those which determine the validity of the estimates produced from the survey, and those which are concerned with the usability of the data, so things like relevance, timeliness, and cost effectiveness. The latter group, the data user dimensions, can be seen as a constraint on the former, the data quality dimensions, but are essential in ensuring that the data is used and is impactful for the client. So I won't go through each of these in detail, but we consider the accuracy, credibility, comparability, coherence, completeness, relevance, timeliness, and cost effectiveness. Not all dimensions will be relevant to all surveys, so we select those which are relevant to the design parameters and the research questions. For each dimension, we devise a series of indicators based on the specific requirements of the new survey. So what does accuracy mean for this survey? What does credibility mean for this survey, etc.? And we take those questions to create a pro forma, which we then systematically review each design against the pro forma to assess the extent to which it meets the survey requirements. The next stage is the modeling stage, and in practice, the total survey quality optimization strategy is iterative. So therefore, once we've conducted a top-level review against the dimensions outlined in the total survey quality framework and agreed the most promising design or designs, we then move to developing the chosen methodological approach in a bit more detail. The aim of this model design phase is to produce a detailed summary of the proposed design features. These could include the mode or modes to be used, the sampling approach, the communication and contact strategy, the incentive strategy, the fieldwork approach, assumptions around response rates, and the required data outputs. And at this stage, we work with the survey funder to discuss the potential trade-offs that the chosen design may bring and that were identified in the previous evaluate stage, and to work through mitigation strategies to minimize those trade-offs and ensure that the design is responsive to their needs. The end goal is to model an approach that allocates the resources available to meet the survey objectives in such a way as to maximize the accuracy of the data collected. So the output at this stage is a detailed summary of the proposed design features and any evidence gaps where we need more information. Once the preferred approach has been outlined, the next stage is to design and develop the new survey. The aim of this stage is to have a fully designed survey ready to begin field trials. This stage can involve a number of different work streams, including the redesign and testing of data collection tools. That can include both questionnaires and non-questionnaire data collection tools such as diaries, the design and of contact strategies and respondent-facing materials, the design of field documents and instructions, and the design of detailed fieldwork procedures. Wherever possible, when transforming a survey, it's important to obtain quantitative evidence of the impact of any changes in mode or questionnaire design. This is so that key assumptions can be tested and refined, and any trade-offs in representation, measurement, respondent experience, time and cost can be fully understood prior to making any transition. The aim of this stage is to fill any evidence gaps identified in the model and design stages, and to test and finesse any assumptions made in the survey design to provide robust evidence on any trade-offs inherent in the new modes. The exact scope of this experimentation will depend on the aims and objectives of the survey and the extent of the transformation. This experimentation could be in the form of a pilot or a dress rehearsal, just to test key assumptions, conduct split sample experiments, and ultimately refine the design and administration of the survey. Or it could be in the form of a parallel run, conducting the new survey design alongside an existing survey design for a specified period of time to quantify the extent of both selection and measurement effects. And once the new design has been selected, developed, and tested, the final stage is to launch the new survey. But a key aspect of the total survey error quality approach is to ensure continuous improvement. So as such, we always recommend regular reviews of surveys to ensure that they continue to deliver the required level of data quality and usability in answering their bespoke research questions. We see the survey transformation process as a sort of continuum rather than just a finite piece of work. So at NatCen, we've used the remodel approach successfully on a number of different research projects. Most notably, we've used the remodel approach as the structural framework for the British Social Attitudes Survey Transformation Programme. This is a 3-year programme to review the end-to-end design of the BSA and explore the feasibility of transitioning the BSA from a face-to-face design to a web-first design. And I'm now going to talk through how we've applied the remodel approach to BSA and some of our findings. First, just a quick background to BSA. Until 2019, the British Social Attitudes Survey was an annual face-to-face survey using a random probability sampling design, and it was designed to measure and track changes in social, political, and moral attitudes. It's been running since 1983 and has an annual sample of around 3,000 or 4,000, depending on the amount of content that we need to cover. So it's got a long-running trend data series. And importantly, it uses a multi-funder design. So NatCen owns and operates the BSA, but funders are able to purchase space to ask their own questions on the survey. And because of that, scalability is very important. It needs to be reactive to the amount of content that is sold for the survey. So when we were looking at alternative options for the BSA, the first step was to conduct an end-to-end review of the survey and determine its key design parameters. This was done through consultation with survey funders, data users, and management. And the key design parameters that we identified were maintaining the long-term time series is essential. The BSA is seen as the gold standard of research design, so any future design needs to be similarly robust to maintain the same level of credibility. It needs to support a multi-funder model, so it needs to be scalable depending on the content it needs to cover. It needs to deliver data in a similar timescale to the face-to-face BSA, and it needs to be delivered at a cost that's either the same or ideally lower than the face-to-face BSA. So we identified 5 possible design options as being capable of meeting the design parameters. These were face-to-face, the normal design, a pure push-to-web survey, push-to-web with the option of opting into a CAPI survey to cover the offline population, push-to-web with a paper follow-up survey for non-responding addresses, and push-to-web with a face-to-face follow-up for non-responding addresses. This chart is just a very high-level summary chart, a visualization to show how we assessed each mode against the 7 design parameters. Green box means that we've determined that it's likely to meet the design parameter. Orange means that we think it's likely to meet the design parameter, but with some concerns or unknowns. Red means that it doesn't meet the design parameter. And blue is that it's just unknown and we need more information to determine how likely it is to meet the design parameter. So the approach we took was that if any box is red, then the design is ruled out. So we ruled out the option of a pure push-to-web survey because the the risk of coverage error by excluding those who aren't online. And we ruled out the push to web with paper follow-up for non-responding addresses, although it's got good credibility in use in high quality surveys like the Community Life Survey, the Actual Life Survey, Survey of Londoners, amongst many others. We rejected it due to concerns about its suitability in a multi-funder model. The most recent BSA had 12 versions of the questionnaire, which makes it very complex to design and program. And having a paper version of that would be very complex. We'd either need to have multiple paper questionnaire versions or have very complex routing, which people would be unable to follow in a paper questionnaire. So we felt that push to web with face-to-face follow-up for non-responding addresses potentially had the most potential. There are some unknowns with that design about the comparability and coherence due to the potential for measurement effects by operating self-completion and interviewer-administered modes together in the same survey. And any scope for savings in the cost were unclear, but we determined that was worth exploring further. And then the pandemic happened. So all face-to-face fieldwork was paused indefinitely in March 2020, which meant that the 2020 BSA could not be run as a face-to-face survey as had been planned, and that a Web-CAPI trial was not feasible. We just wouldn't be able to do the face-to-face fieldwork. So we were left with the options of just not doing the BSA, just leaving it for a year, or trying something else during 2020. So we decided to rapidly transition the 2020 BSA to a Web-CAPI design. So that's a push-to-web survey, but giving people the option of opting in to take part by telephone to allow the offline population to take part. Doing that allowed us to capture important attitudinal data during the pandemic and allowed us to gain more understanding of operating BSA with a web-first design. During the modeling phase, we identified the key design features. I won't go through the rationale for all of these in detail here because we don't have the time to do so. But the key design features we went with were push to web with CATI opt-in. We decided to have 3 mailings with an optional 3rd reminder to boost response if necessary. The telephone option was just made explicit in the 3rd mailing to push as many people to web as possible and limit the scope for some mode effects within the survey. We decided to allow up to 2 adults to take part per household rather than attempting a random or quasi-random selection by respondents. We used a £10 conditional incentive, and when it came to the questions, they were tweaked for the mode rather than redesigned from scratch. Taking the starting concept and redesign the question from scratch would have taken a significant amount of time and testing that we didn't have for this survey. In the more detailed design phase, we did a full review of the face-to-face classification and core survey questions using the questionnaire appraisal system framework and the NatCen mode effect framework. Questions which were at greater risk of measurement error were identified, and we aimed to minimize variance across modes and retain the original questions as much as possible to allow us to compare the data with the previous survey years. So think about the experiment itself. Fieldwork was conducted from the 30th of October to the 7th of December 2020 and resulted in just under 4,000 productive interviews from just under 3,000 households. As well as operating the main BSA itself by this mode, the experimental objectives were to measure online engagement and response rates, to compare the sample profile with that achieved in the face-to-face BSA and against actual figures using mid-year estimates and the labour force survey estimates, to compare estimates generated against those generated in the BSA 2019, and to inform the design of a future Web-CAPI trial. It's important to note that in this analysis, the pandemic meant that no comparisons with face-to-face BSA are truly experimental. We obviously couldn't do a parallel run, so we're comparing against a pre-pandemic data source. So some interpretation is needed when looking at these results. So now to go through the findings, in order to measure the sample quality of the push to web BSA, we set 3 initial criteria, those being response rate, the achieved sample profile, and weighting efficiency. In terms of response rate, direct comparison with the face-to-face is slightly tricky in that the face-to-face and push-to-web BSA were trying to do slightly different things. The face-to-face takes a random selection of 1 individual per household, while the push-to-web allows up to 2 people per household to take part. So we felt the fairest comparison was the household level response rate, defined as the proportion of eligible addresses where at least 1 person took part. Assuming the same level of deadwood as the face-to-face BSA, the 19 BSA, the push-to-web survey had a response rate of 14% compared to a 44% within the face-to-face BSA. So switching from face-to-face to push-to-web results in a significant drop in response rate, which is what we'd expect. But we know that response rates are only a very blunt measure of sample quality. And so to measure the sample quality in more detail, we identified 9 key geodemographic variables present in both the 2019 and 2020 BSA surveys, for which we have national estimates, and we compared both modes against the national profile and against each other. Overall, the findings were pretty positive, both for the face-to-face and the push-to-web designs. They both showed little difference by sex, age, and region. Looking at binary ethnicity, so just comparing white versus BME, they had a similar profile in both the face-to-face and push-to-web surveys. But there was some indication looking at a more detailed breakdown of ethnicity that push-to-web is less good at reaching some minority ethnic groups. In the BSA, we found in particular that Black people were slightly less well represented in the push-to-web than was the case in the face-to-face. By tenure, there are some differences. The push-to-web overrepresents owner-occupiers at the expense of social renters, whereas the face-to-face slightly underrepresents mortgage holders. There were bigger differences by education. The push-to-web survey fairly substantially overrepresents those with higher level qualifications, those with a degree or above. And that's a group which is actually slightly underrepresented in the face-to-face. The face-to-face is particularly good at sort of accessing people with no qualifications, and that group is again sort of underrepresented in the push-to-web. And the push-to-web better represents economic activity. So the push-to-web survey is better at capturing those in employment than face-to-face, and the face-to-face slightly overrepresents those who are economically inactive. So there are sort of advantages and disadvantages of each. One measure of the representativeness of a respondent sample is its weighting efficiency after it's been calibrated to a benchmark. So a perfectly representative sample will have a weighting efficiency of 100%, indicating there's no variance in response probabilities observed. In contrast, a weighting efficiency of, say, 50% indicates that a lot of the variance was observed and compensatory weighting was quite extensive. We can see from this table that the weighting efficiency of the push-to-web survey is 74%, which is similar to that of the most recent face-to-face surveys. So we picked out the 18 and 19 surveys, which had 76% and 77% respectively. And that means that the push-to-web survey is similarly efficient as the face-to-face survey in weighting terms and has a good level of precision. So we would not expect the variance of estimates to be larger in the push-to-web mode. And in that respect, it could be argued that the lower response rate has not unduly damaged the representativeness of the responding sample. But a lower response rate in push-to-web survey does raise some concerns of within-cell bias. So that is, while the survey may be demographically representative after weighting, based on known characteristics, weighting will not reduce any bias that arises within weighting classes. So respondents may be representative of the survey by the demographics that we can measure, but they may be behaviorally or attitudinally different to the target population. And that leads us on to looking at data quality. To measure data quality, we compared estimates generated in the push-to-web BSA with those generated in the most recent face-to-face BSA, again with the acknowledgement that this is not experimental, so there's sort of the pandemic effect to take into account as well. we use the general election vote recall and turnout as a robust real-life comparison. And we look at other data quality indicators such as item non-response, level of dropouts, consent to follow-up, etc. In terms of comparability of estimates, the picture is varied and slightly complex, but for social attitudes, which we would not necessarily expect to change significantly over time, estimates from the push-to-web survey are mostly in line with the face-to-face estimates. So for example, here on this table, we've picked out some estimates for social trust, views on taxes, welfare, and the death penalty. And here the estimates are very much in line between the 2020 and 2019 surveys, and there are no significant differences. So generally speaking, social attitudinal questions get a very similar result in the push-to-web as they did in the face-to-face. BSA also collects a vote recall for major elections, which gives us a good real-life measure of sample and data quality. This chart, using weighted estimates, shows that the average error on vote recall against the actual general election results for the last 3 general elections. So what we can see is that the average error is 1.4% against the actual general election result for the 2019 general election. So that's from the push-to-web survey. And that's very much in line with the average error we find in the face-to-face surveys after other general elections. So on reported vote, the data are no worse than the 2017 and 2015 BSAs. What we find is that results do skew slightly more towards Labour than the actual result, but it's no more so the case that happens in the push-to-web survey than in the face-to-face survey. Similarly, when looking at vote recall for the EU membership referendum, the results skew towards Remain, but no more so than for the face-to-face BSA. So infamously, the 48% of the population voted Remain. We had an error on that of about 6 percentage points in the 2020 push-to-web BSA. But as you can see from this chart, that's very much in line with the error we get in other BSA surveys as well. But one some major issue we identify with the data quality is that the sample is much more politically engaged. So if we look at the proportion who say that they have a great deal or quite a lot of interest in politics, that's 39% in the face-to-face survey and 46% in the 2020 push-to-web BSA. There is potential that there could be some pandemic effect in that, but our view is that it's unlikely to account for such a rise. So there is sort of clear evidence in our view that the sample is more politically engaged. And this is also sort of borne out in other metrics within the survey. So the sample is more likely to support a political party. So 44% in 2020 supported a political party compared to 36% in the previous year. And this extra engagement is particularly reflected in the turnout estimate for the most recent elections. So the push-to-web BSA significantly overestimates turnout. If we take the 2019 general election, the actual turnout was 67%, but the proportion of people within our sample who said they voted was 86%. So that gives us an error of 19 percentage points, whereas the previous face-to-face BSAs have had a much better a closer result with an error of about 4 points. So we typically overestimate turnout, but to a much greater degree in the push-to-web survey. But on the positive side, the balance between the parties remains quite even. So the 2019 face-to-face BSA showed Conservative and Labour with 30% and 29% support respectively, while the 2020 push-to-web BSA has them at 33% and 34% respectively. So although the sample is more politically engaged, it doesn't seem to skew more heavily to one side or the other, and that's the same as the face-to-face. There are naturally a number of other data quality issues to consider when switching modes, and we just pulled out some highlights here. So in terms of item non-response, the push-to-web survey tends to have lower levels of don't know and prefer not to say answers, particularly for sensitive questions. So if we take the example of personal income, we had 11% in the push-to-web survey saying they don't know or prefer not to say, compared to 16% in the face-to-face survey. Dropout rates are always a concern for web surveys. We found that 5% of people who accessed the survey at all did not complete it, which is relatively low compared to other British web surveys, so it's not particularly a concern for us. Another measure of sample quality might be the level of consent to follow-up research, and that was higher in the push to web survey. So we got a 83% consenting to be recontacted compared to 70% in the face-to-face. And just some other thoughts is that the scalability of the push to web gives the opportunity to reduce respondent burden by spreading the content across a larger sample. So for instance, the median completion time for the 2020 BSA was 29 minutes and around an hour or so for the face-to-face. That's obviously not the time taken for the same content. It's just a representation of how we can have shorter surveys for a lower cost within push to web by increasing the sample size and spreading the content across the larger sample. On the negative side, the offline population is not adequately represented within the push to web BSA. The telephone interviews only accounted for about 1% of completed interviews. So the online population was estimated at 99% in the push to web, and face-to-face is much better at representing the offline population. We've done some analysis and it doesn't appear to have a notable impact on estimates. So if we take out the offline population from the face-to-face BSA, it doesn't have a significant impact on most estimates, but nevertheless, it's a notable feature of the push to web survey and something for sort of further investigation and refinement. Finally, it's important to consider the data user dimensions, in particular around timeliness and cost effectiveness. In terms of timeliness, the push to web approach offers scope for quicker data. The average field length of the face-to-face BSA was around 16 weeks. That's to allow for a staggered release of sample and reissues, but nonetheless is quite a long period. Whereas the push to web data collection can be done in around 6 weeks. So there's scope to reduce the time between the survey going into field and the data being delivered by about 10 weeks. In terms of cost effectiveness, it's difficult to be precise because each approach has different costing approaches. But comparing the cost for a 40-item module on a 3,000 sample on BSA, the cost of the push to web is around 49% cheaper than the face-to-face. So switching between face-to-face to push to web has the potential to significantly reduce the cost of the survey. Finally, before I hand over to Shanna, I just want to summarize some of the trade-offs that we've identified as being involved in switching from face-to-face to push to web. For accuracy, switching modes results in a drop in response, as we've seen, but the overall representativeness of the sample is similar. But there is some evidence of within-cell bias. In terms of credibility, there will be some concerns over lower representation of social renters, those with no educational qualifications, and the offline population within the push to web survey. And for comparability, as we've seen, estimates for social attitudes questions tend to be similar, and reported vote figures are in line with the face-to-face, but the sample is much more politically engaged in the push to web survey. Looking at completeness, the push to web design is easily scalable, can reduce respondent burden, and has lower levels of don't know, prefer not to say responses. And finally, as I've just shown you, the push to web survey reduces the delivery timeline and reduces the cost. So there are lots of different trade-offs to consider. So in conclusion, the work we did on the 2020 BSA so it allowed us to think that the push to web mode is a viable alternative to face-to-face administration for BSA, particularly during the pandemic period when face-to-face is not possible or is very uncertain. Push to web offers a number of benefits in providing a robust sample and comparable estimates at a lower cost and in a shorter time period. And it's got the potential to reduce respondent burden while retaining that lower cost. The push to web design is particularly successful in gaining participation of people who are degree educated and economically active, who aren't always necessarily that well covered in face-to-face. But the face-to-face is much more successful in accessing harder to reach populations. So some minority ethnic groups, social renters, the economically inactive, those with no educational qualifications, etc. And the low response rate for push to web raises some concerns about within cell bias. The sample is much more politically engaged. And because of that, we think there's a strong case for experimenting with a Web-CAPI approach to see if it reduces the bias that's apparent in the push to web design. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Shanna, who's going to talk about the experimentation we've done looking at a Web-CAPI BSA.
So this presentation will focus on the Web-CAPI experiment, which, as Peter mentioned, is one element of the wider British Social Attitudes Transformation Programme. So I'll probably use various terms slightly interchangeably, so apologies for that. But just to clarify what I mean by CAPI, so this is computer-assisted personal interviewing, and is kind of traditionally conducted by a trained interviewer, and is typically administered in the respondent's home, so all a bit pre-COVID. So the web part kind of refers to the first mode respondents are offered, and then if they don't take part via this mode, then they're followed up by an interviewer to take part in this CAPI, or also known as kind of face-to-face interview. So just to recap, the push to web with face-to-face CAPI follow-up was identified as a strong design option when reviewed against the dimensions concerned with the quality and usability of the data, which was part of the evaluation phase of the remodel approach. Okay, so the main aim of this experiment is to examine whether a Web-CAPI approach is methodologically and operationally feasible. And a further aim is to establish whether a Web-CAPI design improves on some of the sample and data quality issues that Peter identified in the 2020 web-only survey experiment, and also face-to-face designs pre-2020. So the key objectives are to compare the web-only response rates with mixed mode response rates, so that's the web and the CAPI, compare the socio-demographic characteristics of the responding samples to understand selection effects. So does a Web-CAPI improve the sample profile produced by the web-only models, and compare the survey estimates generated in the Web-CAPI trial against existing sources, so such as BSA 2019, to understand measurement effects. And finally, to evaluate the design and operation of BSA going forwards. Sorry, I'm just going to, my screen has gone a bit funny with the notes. Okay. Okay, so this experiment is being conducted on the 2021 British Social Attitudes. However, only a subset of the sample, so it's around about a 12th, was flagged as experiment version. And so due to the modular approach of BSA that Peter mentioned, we just selected one version of the questionnaire, and this contained the modules and topics which were kind of most useful for us in terms of comparing the estimates for key measures. So things related to political engagement, trust in various institutions, and equality. So just to name a few topics. The experiment sample was clustered. So that's in contrast to the rest of the 2021 BSA sample, which of course isn't necessary because it's in web. And that was to make the fieldwork, the face-to-face fieldwork more efficient. So the first stage involved sending all sampled addresses an invite to take part in the survey online. So this included information about the survey, and importantly, the web link and 2 access codes to take part. And yeah, so it had 2 access codes because at that point we were inviting up to 2 people per household to take part in the web only part. And then, so that was the initial invite, and then a further reminder letter was followed up about a week later to non-responders. So this was the approach that was used for the full BSA sample. And then, so this is where the kind of experiment groups start to diverge a little bit. So for all households that were flagged as an experiment version, they were then sent a further letter explaining that an interviewer would visit And then about a week later, that's when the idea was the interviewers would then visit the household, make contact, and then conduct the interview in home. And at this point, we reverted to the kind of face-to-face selection procedures. So at this point, it was only one adult per household that was randomly selected. And they were encouraged to take part in an in-home interview. Because the kind of concerns around COVID, we still offered a kind of telephone contingency, which wasn't ideal, and in a kind of non-COVID world, we wouldn't have done that, but it was just to make sure that we were kind of maximising the opportunity for people to take part. So the kind of main web part of the BSA took place in kind of September, October, so 2021, and then the web follow-up started. It was kind of towards late October, and it is currently ongoing. So we're due to finish fieldwork on the 31st of January. And so once this is complete, we'll then start preparing the data. So that will involve kind of merging data sets, because the face-to-face was in Blaze, whereas the web survey was in UI. So we need to kind of bring those together. So there'll be a bit of kind of data management with that. And then the data will be weighted. So it'll be ready to kind of start analysing probably kind of springtime, with a view to reporting on our findings over the summer kind of autumn period. We also feedback on a couple of kind of additional follow-up elements that we did. So we conducted a focus group with a selection of interviewers that worked on the experiment, to kind of gain insight into how they conducted the survey in the field, and also get a sense of how they managed things around kind of coding out the web complete. So because the web was open when they were still in kind of face-to-face mode, so it was just to establish how that worked and any kind of glitches with it. And we're also planning on following up with some of the respondents that took part in the face-to-face interview, as well as some that took part in the web. And again, just to kind of get a further understanding of their kind of reasons for taking part in the mode that they did, but that's still in the early stages of development. So I'm now going to move on to highlighting some of the challenges that have arisen as part of our work on the experiment to date. So the first point to note is that because we had the different selection procedures for both the face-to-face, so that was where we were only selecting one adult randomly, and up to 2 people could take part in web. We did have a bit of an issue where we couldn't stop a kind of unselected household member going on to complete the web, even if they weren't selected for the face-to-face interview. So we want to kind of look into that in a bit more detail and just establish we don't think it happened very often, but we just want to have a look at that, and also think about how we would deal with that going forward when administering a kind of mixed mode survey where you've got more than one mode running at the same time. So the next 3 points relate to the challenges with introducing modules and sections that were previously designed for face-to-face into web. So we've got things like the household grid, which is obviously quite kind of complex and there's quite a lot to it. Things like occupation coding, which again are kind of set up for a face-to-face approach where interviewers can kind of probe around the types of jobs that people do, and then they're kind of later coded back in the office. So how do you deal with that in web? And also dealing with response options such as don't knows, refusals and spontaneous responses, which can't really be handled in web in the same way that they can in face-to-face. And obviously there's kind of challenges around that in terms of how you then compare the data collected in one mode versus another, and also how that impacts on the kind of trend series as well. And the final point here relates to managing the questionnaire length. So whereas in face-to-face, it's more acceptable to have a longer questionnaire because you've got an interviewer to motivate respondents to kind of keep going. So a kind of hour-long face-to-face interview doesn't seem kind of too big a request almost, but with a web survey where you've not got that interviewer kind of involvement, then you have to kind of make it shorter really. Okay, So yeah, so moving on to some of the challenges that we faced when kind of more when it was being administered in the field, kind of current, it's obviously still in the field, but the kind of initial thoughts around this. So one of the things here is just kind of clarifying the interviewer role in multimode surveys and dealing with their kind of terms and conditions. So well, they tend to work on kind of primarily on face-to-face surveys, it's a bit less kind of straightforward in a multi-mode survey where they're potentially selling the survey on the doorstep, but there's nothing to kind of stop that respondent actually completing online. So how do you deal with that in terms of it's the interviewer that's kind of motivated them to do that probably, but how do you manage that because they haven't actually conducted the survey with them? So again, kind of going forward, we want to think about how to deal with that situation as well. And so I think, yeah, Peter kind of touched on this a little bit as well, but linked to this is the challenge associated with the different time requirements for various modes. So whereas web can be issued and completed in quite a short time frame, any mode which involves interviewers, so that would kind of be face-to-face or to some extent telephone as well. It needs that kind of longer kind of run-in period in terms of training, but also longer in the field to actually kind of visit the addresses and conduct the interviews as well. Another issue that we came across with the BSA experiment was how to minimise mode effects when we were using multiple modes in the design as well. So for example, on BSA in the past, so kind of pre-2020, there was a paper self-completion, which was part of the face-to-face design, and that included more questions likely to be impacted by social desirability. So it was quite straightforward. We moved that to a kind of CASI approach for the face-to-face, and obviously web is self-complete anyway, so it kind of, there are similarities in the mode there. But then when you're kind of introducing something like telephone, where it's much more difficult to have a kind of self-complete mode, then how do you kind of build that in if you've got maybe 3 different modes, and ensuring that people aren't kind of impacted by that social desirability issue. So yeah, as I've mentioned, we'll have the results of those, if the experiment kind of hopefully later in the year. But before drawing to a close, I really wanted to highlight some of the priorities that we've identified, which were kind of mainly linked to the things, the challenges associated with the BSA experiment, but also kind of other projects that we're working on in the centre, and what we want to take forward. So the first few are kind of related to the experiment. So we want to look at and kind of test and refine how best to collect information on occupation and how to code that in a kind of web approach. We also want to look at the feasibility of a 2-stage respondent selection process as part of the web first approach. So again, kind of touching on the difficulties when you've got 2 different selection procedures depending on the mode. We also want to look a bit more closely at falsification and examining the best way to identify when it's happening, as well as any kind of mitigating actions. We'd also like to look at considering different incentive approaches and testing these for kind of web first surveys. Again, kind of thinking through the interviewer role and any training needs associated with that. And also kind of a bit separate to BSA and the BSA experiment, we also want to look at digitising analog data collection tools. So again, we're involved in that on other projects, as well as kind of looking a bit more closely at passive data collection and the potential use of that. And finally, again, kind of building on the BSA experiment work, is also looking into the feasibility of a kind of targeted face-to-face follow-up going forward as well. Okay, so that's yeah, that's all the presentation there.
Thank you so much, Shanna, and also to you, Peter. We're pushing 6 o'clock, but as there's no chilled Chardonnay waiting outside the door, I'm going to beg your indulgence to take as many questions as I can squeeze in. I'm going to mainly select things which are going to offer snappier answers rather than very open, speculative ones, if that's okay with people. So I'm working down a list. Particularly interested, Natalie wants to know more about this design decision to remove the respondent selection and to allow multiple respondents in the household. Was there any effect on data quality from doing this?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it's one of the sort of the real limitations of push to web survey design, that there's sort of limited evidence of the success of using random or quasi-random selection methods in push to web surveys. So because of that, survey organizations have taken so broadly one of two approaches with the push to web surveys to respondent selection, and that's either allowing all adults to take part, generally sort of allowing up to 4 or more, or limiting the number of adults who can take part. Both have advantages and disadvantages. We tend to side on the approach of allowing up to 2 adults to take part, given that sort of the majority of households have up to 2 adults, about sort of 85% or so. And so that sort of gives a sort of good balance between limiting the risks of selection bias while minimizing sort of risk of fraud. If you allow some more adults, there is potential scope for people to create sort of fake responses so they can get the incentives. In terms of the impact on sort of data quality, there's likely to be some sort of impact of sort of inter-household clustering on the precision of estimates. So it's likely to have some sort of impact. I mean, our view is that it's probably outweighed by the gains achieved through sort of reduced sort of household selection weights, but it's an interesting area, and sort of one of the things that we want to look at, as Shanna mentioned, are sort of alternative respondent selection approaches within push to web surveys, particularly looking at whether there's scope to do a sort of 2-stage approach where any one person takes part in the survey, completes a household grid, and then a sort of random selection is done after that based on the sort of known household composition. But it's a sort of tricky thing to get right and trial. But yeah, it's definitely something for us to think about.
Super, thank you. Helen asks about how you took the decisions on identifying questions where you thought mode would have an impact. Was it particular types of question, and how did you adapt them to try and eradicate those differences?
So yeah, we used a couple of sort of systematic tools to review the questionnaire and look for questions which we thought were more prone to mode effects. So that's the QAS, the questionnaire appraisal system, and there's the NatCen mode effect review framework, which is something that was developed, I think, for Understanding Society, and that sort of groups questions into sort of typologies which are more at risk of mode effects, so whether they're more at risk of satisficing and that sort of thing. So we use that to identify questions which we thought were more at risk. But there's also a sort of art to it, as well as you know, as well as the sort of the science of sort of using your sort of skill as a researcher to interpret what sorts of questions you think might be more prone to changing over time, and those which aren't. Which is why a sort of parallel run would be the ideal, so we could control for any of those effects.
Thank you. Nick asks, given the fact that it was overwhelmingly, the balance between web and CATI was overwhelmingly towards web, in practice, how did the survey actually differ from what you might call simple push to web?
Not a huge amount, I suppose, in reality. So it differs in that the offline population were given the chance to take part. If it's just purely push to web, if you don't have access to the internet, or you're not sort of tech savvy, for want of a better phrase, then you don't have the option of taking part. By including the CATI opt-in, everyone who was selected theoretically had the opportunity to take part, but in practice, as I sort of mentioned in the presentation, the CATI opt-in was very limited in this instance. Possibly, we think, because of the way it was presented within the communications, we took the decision before the survey to only have it as an explicit option in the third mailing, because we wanted to have as many people complete online as possible, because we sort of have some concerns about sort of mode effects. But for other surveys that we've done, we've had it more explicitly, and we've had a much higher proportion of people taking part online by telephone. So that sort of balance of not wanting people to take part by telephone if they could potentially complete it online, but getting as sort of many of the offline population as possible to take part. So the short answer is, data-wise, it didn't differ massively from a push-to-web survey at all.
Okay. A different Nick noticed, like I did, that the weighting efficiency and design effects were about the same between the two. Did you get gains in precision from not needing to use a clustered sample design?
So this is something we've looked at and are still sort of looking at. Not really, would be my conclusion. The sort of impact of clustering was quite sort of similar, I guess, across both surveys. So it didn't seem to increase the precision particularly, but it's something we're still sort of looking at in a bit more detail.
Okay. Another one, this is from Rachel. Did you have to adjust your weighting approach with the move to push to web, for example, to correct for some of these biases, re-education / tenure, etc.? Yes.
Yeah. So the weighting approach to the push to web survey differs from the face to face in a number of ways. Probably the most sort of visually obvious is that we use more calibration targets for the push to web survey than we do for the face to face. Face to face just tends to be calibrated to sort of interlocked age and gender within region, whereas we use a few more variables for the calibration to correct for some of the known differences and known non-response in the push to web survey. And there are also sort of slightly more technical differences around sort of correcting for selection within households, which is all sort of outlined in more detail in the BSA technical report, which is available on our website.
Okay, similar type of thing in a way. Rory asks, what will be on the Web-CAPI? What will be your approach for identifying and correcting for mode effects, especially in terms of time series comparisons?
Yeah, so it's still something we're sort of working on. The analysis plans are sort of coming together, but haven't sort of done it in a huge amount of detail. I mean, one of the things we want to do, because obviously there's no sort of parallel run, one of the things we have done is put some questions on the BSA which are on the ESS, which allows us sort of face-to-face parallel run for those sort of few variables, and the surveys are running at sort of broadly sort of similar time. So we can sort of use that for a sort of benchmark face-to-face comparison. But I don't know, Shanna, if you've got any other sort of thoughts about what we're looking at.
I think, yeah, it probably feels a bit kind of early days at the moment. So yeah, we'll probably report back when we've got a bit more kind of clearer plans on that.
Okay. Charlotte asks, it would be good to understand how you collected the occupation data. Was it free text or lookup?
So on the BSA experiment, at the moment we have a kind of, I've got it here in front of me, so it has 8 categories altogether. So it goes from kind of clerical and intermediate occupations to traditional professional occupations, and it's presented on a show card for face-to-face, and obviously kind of on screen for web. And then there's because obviously that probably doesn't kind of mean much to respondents, it's then got example jobs. So for example, with the clerical and intermediate, it would be kind of secretary, call centre agent, nursing auxiliary. So it's got those kind of examples so that they can kind of select based on that. So it's obviously quite different to free text box. I don't know, Peter, what we did in the 2020 survey. Sorry.
So in the sort of self-completion version of BSA, we've been, rather than sort of using the full 6-SOC approach with write-ins, which we were concerned that without interview administration wouldn't sort of generate enough information to be codable. We just used the sort of simplified ONS self-completion method for collecting occupation codes. So it is simple, and it's a sort of more cut down version of SOC. Yeah, so in the experiment, as sort of Shanna said, we're going to be sort of doing the full 6-SOC version in the face-to-face element. And one of the things that the centre is going to be looking at over the next year is sort of the optimal approach to doing occupation collection within web surveys.
Okay, I'm going to ask you 2 more. One's very specific and one's speculative. Megan asked, there were fewer don't know, prefer not to say's options. Were these shown straight away on screen, or were they shown if respondent tried to skip?
I think currently it's only if they've tried to skip, which I think was the same in 2020, Peter, is that right?
Yeah, so our default approach in web surveys is to only show don't know, prefer not to stay if people try to skip.
Okay, thank you. And then sort of slightly different riffs on the same thing from Sally and from Muriel, which is essentially what's going to happen in future. So what would be your preferred approach for BSA in future, or will you stay with something sort of hybrid? And is there an expectation that you might move more surveys to web, and if so, when?
So in terms of the future of the BSA, it's sort of very difficult to say. Obviously, the pandemic has sort of made everything sort of much more complicated and sort of confused timelines around our experimentation, and we wouldn't want to prejudge the outcome of the Web-CAPI experiment. So my sort of view is that the long-term future for sort of high quality surveys is likely to still involve some form of face-to-face element. And one of the things that we're particularly interested in looking at with BSA is whether a sort of targeted face-to-face follow-up is a feasible option to sort of address some of the biases we see in the push-to-web design at a lower cost than issuing the face-to-face issuing the whole sample to face-to-face. So that's something we're going to be looking at. The sort of broad idea with BSA is that we'll look to sort of have a more sort of the future mode of BSA will be sort of much clearer for the 2024 survey. So it's still an ongoing piece of research. And in terms of transitioning more surveys to push to web, and I think one of the things that we were sort of very keen on with the Transformation Centre is that each survey should be taken in its own merits, and should any decision on future mode should be really dependent on the sort of research needs and the design parameters for that sort of data collection tool. And so therefore I wouldn't want to assume a sort of blanket approach across surveys, but the fact that ONS are digitizing most of their surveys would give some sort of indication that other national statistics surveys might well start following suit, but in what sort of time frame, I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring the curtain down there. Thank you to our speakers for some excellent content, and thank you to you all for your questions. I'm sorry for the ones I didn't get to, but I tried to concentrate on things which were largely very specifically towards the clarifying the content of the talk. But I'm sure we will have colleagues back from NatCen to talk about similar things on another day. So thank you very much. Thanks all for attending, and thanks very much for Stefan Swift, who makes sure that the pictures and the sound reach you safely. Have a lovely evening, and goodbye.